Her hands were the first thing she noticed, and the first thing she could not use. The wet ribbon at her throat was a knot she understood in theory, and could not solve in fact, because the fingers at the end of her arms belonged, just then, to a woman she had once known, and could not quite recall. He stood at the fire with his back half turned, not looking at her, and his voice, when it arrived in the room, arrived flat as a man saying, "Put down the gun. Take off the wet dress," said the way a man who has watched climbers die of cold says a thing, without decoration on it at all, the way one names a tool. The blizzard threw itself against the parlor window in soft white handfuls, and the folio of grayling plates lay on the boards at her feet where she had let it fall, the brown paper already darkening in a slow ring as the melt off her cloak found it. She would remember, later, that her first coherent thought in the room was not about the dress at all. 6 hours earlier, the sky over Sir Henry Lambton's gates had been the bruised colour of pewter held too long in the hand, and the gravel under her boots had crunched with the particular dry sound that gravel only makes when the air has decided. The Lambton butler had wished her a safe journey with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told, somewhere in his service, that Miss Ashford was to be addressed as a guest and treated as a tradesperson, and who had elected on his own authority to treat her as a guest. He had handed up the folio himself, into the inside of the coach, into her lap, before the door closed, and had said only, "Mind the rapping at Whitchurch, miss. The river fog gets in." She had thanked him by name. She always thanked servants by name. It was one of the small consistencies she allowed herself, the way other women allowed themselves a habitual scent. The mail coach had left the Hampshire lanes at first proper light, and made good time as far as Basingstoke, where the snow began as a thin, granular hiss along the windows, and then, somewhere short of Whitchurch, turned. The turning was a thing she felt rather than saw, a shift in the way the coach settled at the corners, a different protest in the springs, a different note in the harness. The guard on the box had begun to sing something under his breath, which she understood, from 3 winters of country travel, to be the particular kind of singing men did to keep their faces from freezing. The lead mare went down past Andover at a place where the road dipped, and the drift had filled the dip without seeming to. The crack of the leg was not the loud thing she would have expected. It was a small, domestic sound, the sound of a stick under a boot in a garden, and the mare did not scream. The mare only lay her great head sideways into the snow, as if she had decided to look at something on the ground. She had carried the folio against her stomach beneath 3 layers of wool, because she could not carry it any other way and remain upright. The other inside passenger, a wine factor from Reading, had carried his own portmanteau on his shoulder, and had not offered to carry hers. She had not asked. The walk was 1/2 mile by the guard's reckoning, and a country mile by her own, and the snow was to mid-thigh in the open, and to the knee in the lee of the hedges. And by the time the boar and hawthorn rose out of the white, as a yellow square of lamp behind glass, she had stopped being able to feel the difference between her cloak and her skin. She had kept the folio dry. That was the only sentence in her head as she put her gloved hand to the latch. She had kept the folio dry. The common room had been the kind of full that coaching inns become only when the road has closed in both directions, every settle taken, every stool, the floor between settles occupied by valises and hat boxes, and a small terrier asleep across a lady's feet. The fire was loud, and the wet wool smelled like every winter she had ever lived through pressed into one room. She had stood inside the door without knowing she had stopped, the latch still in her hand behind her, and the heat had begun to do to her face the thing the cold had done to her hands. There had been one gentleman at the side table with a book, alone, in traveling dress that was very plain and very well made, the kind of plainness that costs. He had looked up from the book at the sound of the door, and his eyes had crossed the room and stopped on her face, and she had seen him put the book down, without marking his place. He had crossed to her without speaking to anyone he passed. He had taken her by the elbow through the cloak, which was a thing no gentleman did to a lady he had not been introduced to, and which she had understood, even through the lamb's wool buzzing in her ears, as a kind of efficient kindness rather than a liberty. He had said something to the innkeeper that she had not caught, and had walked her across the common room toward a door at the back, and the people on the settles had moved their feet to let them pass without looking up, because the people on the settles had also seen her face. And then the parlor, and the fire, and his back half turned and the dropped folio darkening on the boards, and his voice flat as a man saying, "Put down the gun. Take off the wet dress." It landed the second time, the way a held breath lands. She heard it without flinching now, because she had walked the half-mile and dropped the folio and felt the heat of the room find her cheekbones. And she understood the sentence as a sentence about temperature and not about her person. She also understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he had said it to the fire and not to her on purpose, so that she could pretend, if she needed to, that he had not said it at all. She found her voice in the middle of her chest, lower than usual, made of someone else's breath. "The ribbon. I can't." He turned then, only his head, and looked at her hands where they hung at her sides, like two things she had been carrying and forgotten about. He crossed the boards without hurry and stopped a careful arm's length from her, and lifted his own hands and waited, and she nodded once, and he untied the ribbon at her throat with the small, competent movements of a man who had untied wet knots in worse weather than this. He did not touch her skin. He stepped back the same arm's length and turned again to the fire and said, without looking, "There's a screen in the corner. The innkeeper's wife is coming up with dry things. I will be on the other side of that door until she does." He went out. The door closed with the soft click of a latch settling into its keeper, and she stood alone in the parlor of an inn she did not know, with a fire she had not built, and a folio of grayling plates at her feet that had survived the river off her cloak by minutes. And she began, with hands that were beginning to remember themselves, to undo the buttons down her front, one by one, in the order they had been done up that morning by a maid at Lambton whose name was Susan, and who had told her to mind the river fog at Whitchurch. The screen in the corner was painted with a pattern of pheasants in a wood, very faded. She stood behind it in her shift and her stays and the thick wool stockings she had put on in the dark, and she pressed her forehead against the painted wood, and she waited for the innkeeper's wife, and she thought, with the part of her mind that did the work she was paid for, that the 12th plate of the folio was not finished, and that if the inn did not have a clean sheet of paper and a pen with a decent nib, she would have to finish it by the 1st of February, with whatever she could find, because the commission would not wait, and her mother's quarter rent would not wait, and neither would the man on the other side of the door, whose name she did not yet know, and to whom, in the space of the next hour, she was about to give a lie large enough to ruin them both. The dry things, when Mrs. Pell brought them, were a flannel petticoat that had been laundered to the softness of skin, and a wool wrapper the color of weak tea, and a pair of knitted stockings with the heels darned in a hand that was patient rather than skilled. Mrs. Pell laid them on the chair beside the screen and said, "You'll want the wrapper first, miss. The room's warm enough, but you've a chill in you that wants chasing." And she said it with the same level absence of fuss with which she might have offered a second cup of tea. She did not ask whether Clemency wanted help. She waited the proper interval in the doorway, half turned away, and then she said, "The gentleman has stepped down to see about his horse. I'll come back in a quarter-hour to take the wet things." And she went out. Clemency dressed behind the pheasant screen with the patience of a woman who has been cold a long time. She put the flannel petticoat on first, and then the wrapper, and then she gathered the wet dress and the wet stays and the wet stockings and folded them, because folding wet things was an ordinary action, and ordinary actions were the rope by which one climbed out of the kind of cold she had walked through. She came out from behind the screen, carrying the folded wet wool against her ribs, and she set it on the hearth in a neat square, and she crouched and picked up the folio from the floor and laid it on the table away from the fire, and she opened the brown paper carefully, and she looked. The oilcloth had held. The plates were dry. She put her hand flat on the topmost, the male grayling in his spawning fin, the long dorsal arched in the curve she had spent 4 afternoons getting right, and she closed her eyes for one slow breath and opened them again. She rewrapped the folio loosely so the paper could finish drying, and she carried it to the small writing desk by the window and set it down where the light, when there was any, would reach it. Then she went to the fire and stood with her hands held out toward it, and her hands were the color of veal and beginning to hurt, which she understood as a good sign. She heard the door open behind her and did not turn. She heard 2 sets of feet, Mrs. Pell's, light and even, and his, heavier and slower, the gait of a man who had walked a long time in mountains. She heard Mrs. Pell set down something, a tray by the small chime of porcelain, and she heard him stop just inside the room as if he had remembered, suddenly, that she might prefer he stand further off. She turned with the wrapper closed at her throat and her hair down in a single wet plait over her shoulder, and she looked at Mrs. Pell, and she opened her mouth and she said the sentence that would become, in the 4 days that followed, the architecture of everything. "My husband-to-be was good enough to take this parlor for us when the coach overturned," she said, and she said it to Mrs. Pell, and not to him. "We were to have met my chaperone at Andover. She will be very anxious. We are bound for my aunt's at York." Mrs. Pell finished setting down the tray. She straightened. She looked once at Clemency, and once at the gentleman in the doorway, and once back at Clemency. "Of course, miss." And her face did not move, and she said, "I'll have hot water sent up for the gentleman, and broth for you in 10 minutes, and I'll see what can be done about a second bed by morning." And she went out, and the latch settled into its keeper for the second time that night, with the same soft click. He did not move from where he was. He looked at her across the parlour for a long moment, and she made herself meet his look, because she had given him a thing she had no right to give, and the least she owed him was her face while he decided what to do with it. "Forgive me," she said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "I will explain. If you will sit, I will explain." He came forward then, slowly, and he pulled out the chair opposite hers at the small table, and he sat, and he set his hands flat on the wood the way a man sets down a thing he has been carrying. He looked at the folio on the writing desk, and then at her face, and then at the folio again. "Begin with what is in the folio." And she understood, with the same surprise as before, that he had asked the right question first. His name, when he gave it, was Theodore Ravenhall, and the title that came after it she registered as a fact and then set aside, because the title was the largest part of what she had done to him and the smallest part of what she could afford to think about. He gave the name plainly, without flourish, and waited, and she gave hers back the same way. Clemency Ashford of Winchester, daughter of the late Reverend Ashford of St. Cross, and the giving of the names across the table felt like the first sentence of a contract whose terms neither of them had read. She told him about the folio. She told him quickly, because quickness was the only currency she had left. She told him about the publisher in Paternoster Row who had taken her plates for 3 years under the initials C.A., because the initials would sell where the name would not, and about the East India dividends and the annuity that had failed with them, and about the 12th plate that was not finished, and about the 1st of February, and about her mother's quarter rent at the small house in Winchester, where the back parlour smelled always of the river. She told him about Whitchurch, and the mayor, and the wine factor who had not offered to carry her bag, and she told him, finally, why she had spoken before he had. A working woman, caught alone in a duke's parlour, is ruined by the Morning Post, she said, and she did not look away from him while she said it. A betrothed gentlewoman travelling to her aunt is merely indelicate. I gave you the lie because I could think of no faster way to keep both of us upright, and because— She paused and chose and went on. Because I registered in the same breath that you are traveling alone, and a man in your position traveling alone is not traveling toward nothing. I do not know what you are traveling toward. I only know it can lose more in an hour like this one than I can. He listened without moving. When she finished, he sat for a long moment with his hands still flat on the table, and she watched the firelight find the small white line of an old scar at his temple, and the place where his collar had been done up by his own fingers that morning, slightly off true. He did not look angry. He looked, she thought, like a man doing arithmetic he had not expected to do before supper. I am traveling toward a betrothal, he said at last, and the word came out of him with a particular kind of care, as if he were setting it on the table beside his hands to be examined. I have not yet agreed to it. My aunt has arranged it. The lady is the second daughter of a man whose land marches with mine in Northumberland, and the match is, on paper, immaculate. I have met her twice. She was 11 the first time, and 17 the second. I am 34. I have been 6 years in the Pyrenees with a theodolite and a hammer, and I came home to find that my aunt had spent those 6 years writing a kind of contract on my behalf in very small ink. I was going north to read it. He stopped. He looked at the fire and then back at her. You have given me 4 days in which I cannot continue north. You have also given me a reason, if anyone ever asks, why I did not continue. I do not yet know whether to thank you for that, or to be very angry with you. I would prefer, while I work it out, that we do not pretend to each other inside this room. Outside the door, we will be whatever we have to be. In here, plain speech. Will that do? It will do. And she put her hands around the cup of broth Mrs. Pell had left, and the cup was hot enough to hurt, and she held it anyway, because the hurt was useful. The broth had bones in the bottom of the cup, and a leaf of something, thyme perhaps, or savory, and she drank it slowly while he watched her without watching her, the way a man watches a horse he has paid for, to see whether the bargain was good. When the cup was empty, she set it down, and she said, You knew. at the door. You knew before I did." He did not pretend not to follow. "A man went blue in front of me at a refuge above Gavarni 3 winters ago. He had walked 4 hours in wet boots, and he was laughing when he came in, and the laughing was the thing that told us. There is a color the mouth goes. You had it. I am sorry for taking your elbow without your leave." There was not time to ask. "You may take my elbow whenever you like," she said, and she heard the sentence land between them, and she felt her face warm in a way the broth had not caused. And she added, quickly, "In matters of frostbite," and he made a small sound at the back of his throat that was not quite a laugh, and was the first unguarded sound she had heard out of him, and she filed it away the way she filed the curve of a dorsal fin. Mrs. Pell came back for the wet things. She gathered the folded square from the hearth and laid a second wool wrapper over the back of Clemency's chair without being asked, and she said, to the room rather than to either of them, "The gentleman's man is below with his trunks. I've put him in the small room at the head of the stair. The lady will sleep here on the daybed with the fire kept up, and I'll bring an extra coverlet at 10. She paused at the door with the wet bundle against her hip, and she added, "The second bed I spoke of, miss, will not be possible until Wednesday at the earliest. The road is closed at Stevenage, and the Hertford coach is in the yard with 12 inside. There is no room in this house I can give either of you that you do not already have." She looked, then, at Clemency directly, only for a heartbeat, and Clemency understood the look entirely. It was not a look that asked a question. It was a look that said, "I have heard you, miss, and I have not yet decided, and you will know when I have." Mrs. Pell went out. The latch settled. They sat across the small table in the parlour of the Boar and Hawthorn with the blizzard against the window, and the folio of grayling plates drying on the writing desk, and a contract neither of them had written hanging in the warm air between them. And after a long minute he reached across the table, and turned her hand palm up, and looked at the fingertips, which were beginning to come back, and he said, plainly, "You will keep these. The nails will hurt for a week. You will draw again by Friday." And he let her hand go. "Wednesday at the earliest," she said to the fire. "Wednesday at the earliest," he said to the fire. The first day at the Boar and Hawthorn began with the particular grey light that comes through a window banked half its height with snow. Clemency woke on the daybed in the parlour under 3 coverlets and a man's greatcoat that had not been there when she fell asleep, and for a long, disoriented moment she lay still and counted the things she could feel. Her toes, the arches of her feet, the backs of her knees, her fingers, in a slow ascending order, each one announcing itself with the small, private pain of returning blood. She lay under the weight of the greatcoat, heavy wool that smelled of cold air and a faint resinous something, juniper perhaps, or the inside of a cedar trunk. And she did not move for a long time, because the warmth was a thing she had earned, and she meant to spend it carefully. The fire had been mended in the night. She knew this without sitting up, because the room was not the temperature of a fire that had been left. Someone had come in, very quietly, and put on 2 logs and gone out again, and she had not woken. She thought about that for a while, with her eyes closed. When she sat up at last, she folded the great coat with the small, ceremonial care one gives to borrowed things, and laid it over the back of the chair. She dressed in the wool wrapper and the darned stockings, and she went to the writing desk and opened the folio. The plates were dry. The brown paper had stiffened in the drying and would have to be replaced before she could carry the folio out of the inn, but the plates themselves were intact. the 11 finished engravings each in their tissue, the 12th, the female grayling in winter, the one she had been working on at Lambton in the last week, still only at the underdrawing, the pencil ghost of a fish on a sheet of hot-pressed paper. She heard him in the corridor before she heard the door. He knocked, which surprised her, because the room was technically his. And she said, "Come in," and he came in with a tray himself, which surprised her more. "Mrs. Pell is occupied with the Hertford coach," he said, by way of the tray. "There is tea, and there is bread, and there is a thing she called potted hare, which I will not vouch for." He set the tray on the small table and stood back from it. "How are the hands?" "They will draw by Friday. You said so yourself." And she sat down and poured the tea for both of them, because the pouring of tea was an ordinary action, and ordinary actions were still the rope. He took the cup and sat opposite her and looked, deliberately, at the folio on the desk. "May I?" "You may." He went to the desk and stood over the open folio and did not touch it. He looked at the 11 finished plates one by one, turning the tissue back with the edge of his thumbnail and laying it down again with the same care. He looked at the underdrawing of the 12th for a longer time than the others. When he came back to the table, he sat down and he picked up his tea and he said, "The dorsal on the male in spawning condition is exact. I have seen that fish in the Ariège, and you have got the angle of the rays correct, which most plates do not. Where did you draw him?" "The test, below Stockbridge. Sir Henry Lambton's keeper held him in the net for me in 3 inches of water for as long as I needed. He was returned alive. They all were." He looked at her then with a different attention than he had given her the night before. It was not warmer, precisely. It was more particular. It was the attention of a man recognizing, across a table, another person whose work was real. "You drew them from life." "I draw everything from life. I cannot do otherwise. I tried once to draw a pike from a specimen in spirits at the Linnaean rooms, and the result was a fish that had died twice, once in the net and once on the page. I do not work from specimens since." He considered that for a moment, and then he said, with the same quietness, "The 12th is the female." "It is, in winter color, which is the difficulty. The winter female is the plainest fish in the river and looks, to a careless eye, like nothing at all. The plate has to make the case for her, without lying." He set his cup down. "You have 4 days. I have until the 1st of February, which, by your reckoning and mine, is 5 if we are still in this room on Wednesday. I need a sheet of decent paper, a pen with a true nib, and a 1/4 hour of clear daylight a day. The drawing I can do in lamplight. The fine work on the fins I cannot." He nodded once, and finished his tea, and stood. "I will speak to Mrs. Pell about the paper. The nib I can probably supply. I keep one for field notes." "Daylight," he said, looking at the window banked with snow. "Daylight will be a negotiation." He went out, and she sat at the table with a second cup of tea cooling in her hand, and she understood, somewhere under the part of her mind that did the work, that something in the room had shifted between the night before and the morning, and that the shift had to do with the 11 plates of fish that did not look like fish that had died twice, and that she had better be careful, because care was the only thing she had brought through the snow besides the folio, and she could not afford to lose either. Mrs. Pell brought paper at midday. It was hot-pressed, a 1/4 sheet, the kind of paper an inn does not usually keep, and Clemency understood without asking that Mrs. Pell had gone into a private drawer somewhere and chosen to give it. She thanked her by name. Mrs. Pell did not quite smile. "The gentleman," Mrs. Pell said, putting down the paper, "has asked whether you might walk in the stable yard at 3, which is the warmest the day will get, for the sake of your circulation. He has asked me to ask, miss, because he was not certain you would agree if he asked you himself." "He was correct," said Clemency, and Mrs. Pell let one corner of her mouth move, very slightly, and went out. The stable yard at 3 was a small square of trampled snow between the back of the inn and the long, low stable, with the sky above it the color of weak milk, and the air still cold enough to bite at the inside of the nose. He was waiting at the door in his greatcoat. A different one, she registered. The one she had slept under was still on the chair upstairs, and he handed her a pair of borrowed mittens without comment, and walked beside her, not offering his arm, around the perimeter of the yard at a pace slow enough to be polite, and brisk enough to do the work of circulation. They did not speak for the first turn. On the second, she said, "The lead mare." She was put down at first light. The guard saw to it. It was kindly done. They walked another half-turn. "Tell me about the Pyrenees. Not the survey. Tell me something true about them that the survey does not contain." He considered. They walked the length of the stable. "There is a flower that grows in the scree above 2,000 meters. The local people call it the Star of the High Passes. The Latin name does not matter. It opens only in full sun and closes at the slightest shadow, which means that if you stand over it to look at it, it shuts before you have seen it. The only way to see one open is to lie down beside it on your stomach, with your head turned away, and wait. I lay in scree above Gavarnie for 3/4 of an hour to see one. It was the same colour as the inside of a wrist. She did not look at her own wrist, though she felt it. That is a grayling. He glanced at her. Among anglers, the grayling is the fish that vanishes the instant it knows it has been seen. You can stand over a pool with one in it for half an hour and never know it was there. The only way to see one feed is to lie flat on the bank, with your face below the line of the rushes, and even then, if your shadow falls on the water, the pool will be empty before you have understood what was in it. He nodded slowly. They turned the corner of the yard. That is an unfortunate quality in a thing one is trying to know. It is the quality that makes them worth knowing, and the quality that makes them difficult, and the quality that makes most plates of them lie. The plates lie because the engraver was working from a fish in a basket. A fish in a basket is not a grayling. It is the corpse of one. They had completed the perimeter twice. She felt the blood in her cheeks and in her fingers under the borrowed mittens, and she felt, with a clarity that startled her, that she had said a thing about her work she had never said aloud to anyone, and that he had understood it on the first hearing. He stopped at the door of the inn and turned to face her. The wind had brought color into his face too, a hard band of red along each cheekbone, and his eyes in the dull light were the color of wet slate. "Miss Ashford," he said, and the use of her surname was deliberate, an instrument he was choosing on purpose. "I am going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it as plainly as you answered me last night. Was the engagement story the fastest answer you could think of, or was it the best one?" She looked at him for a long moment. "It was both. It was the fastest because it was the best. I have had time today to think of others.
None of them are better. I am sorry. Do not be sorry. I am not asking for sorrow. I am asking because I would like to know whether I am being protected by an accident or by a decision. There is a difference. It was a decision. Thank you, he said, and he opened the door for her, and they went back into the heat of the inn, and Mrs. Pell, passing in the corridor with an armful of linen, looked at the colour in both their faces, and at the snow on neither of their cloaks, and went by without speaking, which was, Clemency understood, a kind of decision of its own. That evening he brought the pen. It was a steel nib in a turned cedar holder, and the nib had been kept clean in a square of chamois leather, and when she tried it on a corner of the new paper, the line came off her hand thin and true, and did not catch. She looked up at him across the table, and she said, "This is a working pen." "It is. I have done 4 years of field notes with it. The wood will smell of cedar. I keep it in a box with shavings. I apologize in advance to the grayling." She laughed. It surprised her. It was a small, dry laugh, half a breath, and it was the first time she had laughed since Andover, and she felt him register it and look away to give her the privacy of having done it. She worked that night by lamp until 11. He sat by the fire with a book, not the one he had been reading in the common room, a smaller, plainer volume, and he did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him, and when she stopped to flex her fingers, he brought her another cup of broth without being asked, and set it down at her elbow, and went back to his chair. The wind dropped a little near midnight. The fire spat once and settled. She drew the long dorsal of the winter female in 9 separate strokes, lifting the pen between each, the way she had been taught by an engraver in Soho when she was 19, and her father was still alive, and the world had a different shape. And she thought, as she set the pen down, that she had not drawn a finer dorsal in 3 years of trying. And she did not know whether the pen was responsible, or the cedar, or the man at the fire. And she decided, with the same care she had given the line, not to know. By the second morning the snow had stopped and the wind had picked up. Mrs. Pell came in at 7 with a fresh tray and a face that had not slept much, and the news that the Hartford coach passengers had been distributed 3 to a room above the kitchens, and that one of them, a Mr. Halford of Lincoln's Inn, had asked after the gentleman in the back parlour, by title, and Mrs. Pell had answered that the gentleman was travelling under a private arrangement with his lady wife's family, and would not be receiving callers, and Mr. Halford of Lincoln's Inn had accepted the answer, because Mrs. Pell had given it in the tone in which one settles a small unpaid bill. She set the tray down. She looked at the day-bed, which had been made up neatly, at the chair, where the greatcoat had been folded again, at the writing-desk, where the folio lay open, and the half-drawn winter female lay beside it. She looked at Clemency. "The gentleman went down at 6 to see about a man with a horse. He will be back within the hour. I will be in the still room drying lavender until 9, miss, and the still room is the warmest room in the house after this one, and the door of the still room has a latch which does not lock, but which I oil weekly, and I am telling you this for no particular reason. Mrs. Pell," said Clemency. "Eat the bread while it is warm, miss," said Mrs. Pell, and she went out. He came back at 8, with the cold of the yard still on him, and a small bundle under his arm which turned out to be a quire of cartridge paper he had bought, somehow, from the saddler across the lane. The saddler used it to pattern the linings of bridles, and it was not hot-pressed, but it was clean and it was true, and he set it on the writing desk beside the folio and said, "In case the first sheet does not survive its first idea." She thanked him. She did not look up while she thanked him, because she was afraid of her own face. She heard him cross to the fire and crouch and mend it and stand again, and she heard him say, without turning, "Mrs. Pell informed me on the stair that she will be in the still room until 9, and that I am to know this for no particular reason. Have you any idea what that woman has decided about us?"
"She has decided something. I cannot yet read which way." He came back to the table and sat down. He did not pour his own tea. He waited until she did it for him, which was a small, ordinary thing, and which they both noticed, and neither commented on. "There is a man downstairs who knows my face. He was at Cambridge with my brother. He has not come up. He has asked after me by title, and Mrs. Pell has put him off with a sentence that did most of the work a marriage license would have done. I do not know whether to feel grateful or compromised." He paused. "I have not felt either of those things in a long time, and I find that having both of them at once is interesting." The word interesting in his mouth was a precise instrument. He used it the way another man might have used worrying or untenable. She filed it away with the rest of him. He went on, "The man downstairs will leave when the road opens. The road will open, by the best guess of the head ostler, on Thursday. Today is Tuesday. By Friday there will be a story in 3 coaching inns between here and London that the Duke of Weatherbourne was snowed in at the Boar and Hawthorn with his betrothed, and by Sunday the story will have reached London, and by Tuesday week it will be in the Morning Post, in the diary column under a careful initial, and by the Friday after that, my aunt will write me a letter that I will need to answer." He stopped. He looked at her across the table. "You understand what that means?" She understood. She set down her cup. She understood that the lie she had told to keep them upright in the parlor on the first night had a shape that did not stop at the parlor door, that it had legs and would walk, that it had been walking, in fact, since Mrs. Pell had carried the dry clothes upstairs, and that by the time she reached the publisher in Paternoster Row with the folio, she would be either the Duke of Weatherbourne's affianced wife in fact, or a young woman who had publicly broken an engagement to a duke, and that there was no third option that did not involve her own ruin and his. "I understand." He nodded. "I do not hold this against you. I want that said plainly. You gave me a sentence in a room where I could not think of one. The sentence has consequences. The consequences are not your debt. We will spend them together, because they cannot be spent separately. I would like, while we spend them, to know you." He paused. "I have been told all my life that I am a difficult man to know. I find this morning that I am, against my own habit, willing to be known. I would like to know how that strikes you." She looked at him across the table for a long time. The fire spoke. The cup in her hand had gone warm. "It strikes me as the truest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years, and as a thing I do not yet know what to do with, and as a thing I would like, please, to be allowed to think about until this afternoon." "You may have until the 1st of February. After that I will require an answer, because by the 1st of February my aunt will require one of me, and I should like to give her the same answer I give you." "That is fair." She finished her tea. She went to the writing desk and bent over the folio, and she did not draw, because her hand was not yet steady enough for the work. She stood there with the pen in her fingers, and she thought about the grayling that vanishes the instant it knows it has been seen,
and she thought about a man who lay on his stomach in scree for 3/4 of an hour to watch a flower open. And she thought that the two of them in this parlor were doing to each other the precise opposite of vanishing, and that the trick now was not to let either of them know it, because the moment of knowing was the moment the pool went empty. The still room, when she found it at 2:30 that afternoon, was at the back of the inn, down 3 stone steps off the kitchen passage. The air inside was warm and dry, and smelled of lavender and tansy, and something resinous Clemency did not at first recognize, and then placed as rosemary stalk, drying upside down on a string above the window. Mrs. Pell was standing at the long table with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, rubbing dried lavender heads off their stems into a wide, flat basket, and she did not look up when Clemency came in. "Sit on the stool. The light at the table is the best in the house. Rub the heads off these for me while I talk, miss, if your hands are equal to it. The work is the kind that brings the blood back without straining." Clemency sat. She took a stem of lavender and rubbed the heads off into the basket with the pads of her thumbs, and the smell came up around her in a soft cloud, and Mrs. Pell, without looking at her, began. "I have run this inn 31 years next March. My husband ran it before me for 14 years before I married him. Between us we have seen, miss, every shape a story can be the wrong shape. We have seen elopements that wanted help, and elopements that wanted stopping. And we have seen abductions dressed up as elopements, and elopements dressed up as visits to aunts. And we have seen, twice in my time, a gentleman bring a woman to this house who was neither his wife, nor his sister, nor his ward. And on both of those occasions, miss, I have known within the first quarter hour what I had upstairs. And on both of those occasions, I have asked the gentleman to leave by the morning coach. And he has left." She paused. She turned a stem in her hand. "When the gentleman upstairs walked into my common room on Monday night, I had him placed in the back parlour, because he asked for privacy and paid for it, and because the look of him was the look of a man who had done nothing in his life that needed hiding from a woman of my age. When you walked through my door an hour later, miss, blue at the mouth and white at the temple, and clutching your stomach like a woman who had carried a child 2 miles in a snowstorm, I had you in my own arms before I knew I had crossed the room, and I would have had you in the kitchen by the range with the maids if the gentleman had not been faster than me. He was faster than me, miss, because he had seen the colour of your mouth from across the room and had moved before he had thought, and a man who moves before he thinks in that direction is a man whose first instinct, miss, is to keep a woman alive. There are not as many of those as the magazines pretend." She rubbed another lavender head. "When I came up the stairs with the dry clothes, I came up expecting to find a young woman in a state of shock, being looked after, at a proper distance, by a gentleman who had taken her into a private room to save her life, and would be sleeping on the floor of the corridor by 10. That, miss, is what I found. The great coat round you was an act of warming, not an act of liberty. The gentleman was on the other side of the door. The door, when I came in, was open behind me. I noted all of this, miss, because I have been noting such things for 31 years, and I cannot, at my age, stop. And then you spoke before he did, and you said the word husband-to-be, and I watched the gentleman's face while you said it. He did not move. He did not flinch. He did not look at you the way a man looks at a woman who has just publicly claimed him without warning. He looked at you, miss, the way a man looks at a person who has just done a brave and necessary thing on his behalf without consulting him, and is wondering how on earth he is going to be worthy of the trouble. Mrs. Pell looked up at last. Her eyes were the color of weak tea, like the wrapper. "I made my decision then, miss. I am telling you now because I do not want you to spend the next 2 days wondering. The story I will tell, when I am asked, is the story you told. I will tell it in such a way that nobody will think to ask twice. I have a cousin in service in Northumberland, miss, who will, if asked, recall a certain Miss Ashford visiting her people at a certain house last autumn. She will recall it because I will write to her tonight, and she will be glad of the small coin I send with the letter. The aunt in York is your invention, and yours to keep alive."
"I would suggest, miss, you give her a name and a street by Friday, because by Friday somebody will ask."
"Mrs. Pell," said Clemency.
"Do not thank me yet, miss. I have not done it for you. I have done it for the gentleman, who is a good man caught in a hard hour, and for myself, because I do not propose to spend the rest of my life knowing I sent a young woman who walked half a mile through a drift back out into a road that would chew her. But I will tell you this, miss, and you will not like it. The story I will tell on your behalf will be the story you have told. If the story stops being true between you, miss, in the months to come, if you go your way and he goes his, and the engagement is quietly dissolved by a notice in the papers, the story will hold. Inns are good at that. But if the story becomes true, miss, if you marry the gentleman in fact, then you will marry him knowing that you began with a lie I helped you keep, and you will have to find a way, the two of you, to forgive each other for it for the rest of your lives. That is not nothing. I want you to know it is not nothing. I want you to think about it before Thursday." She went back to her lavender. The room was quiet for a long minute, except for the small, dry sound of dried heads coming off stems. "Why are you telling me this?" said Clemency at last, "and not him?" "Because, miss, he has been thinking about it since Tuesday breakfast, and you have not yet let yourself begin. I am moving you along." Clemency sat with her hands on the table and the smell of lavender in her hair, and she understood that she had been moved along. She understood also that Mrs. Pell had, with the precision of a woman who had been making such decisions in still rooms for 31 years, just delivered her the only honest sermon she had heard since her father had died, and that the sermon had been delivered free of charge and at considerable personal risk, and that the only proper response to such a sermon was to do as it instructed. She rubbed lavender for another quarter-hour. She and Mrs. Pell did not speak again. When the basket was full, she stood and brushed the dust off her wrapper and went up the back stairs to the parlor, and she found him at the window, looking out at the yard with his hands clasped behind him, in the attitude of a man who had been standing there a long time, and he turned when she came in and looked at her face and did not ask. "I would like to go on knowing you, after the 1st of February, whatever shape it takes." He inclined his head. He did not smile.
"Then we will decide on the shape together. Will you come and sit? There is a thing about the aunt in York I would like us to agree on by supper." The aunt in York acquired, between Tuesday tea-time and Wednesday breakfast, a name, Mrs. Honoria Carmichael, widowed, of Micklegate, a small competence, 300 a year from her late husband, a wine merchant, a slight deafness in the left ear, a fondness for canaries, a parish, St. Martin cum Gregory, and a Christmas habit of sending fruit-cake wrapped in muslin to her unmarried niece in Hampshire. She acquired these things across the small table in the back parlour,
while Clemency drew the winter female grayling, and he sat opposite her with a fresh sheet of paper, writing out, in his small, precise field notes hand, a working sketch of the woman they were inventing, so that if either of them was asked, in the months to come, about Aunt Honoria's canaries, they would not contradict each other. It was an absurd thing to be doing.
It was also, Clemency realised, somewhere in the third hour, the most companionable hour she had spent with another person in 3 years. They worked the way two people work who are building something together that has to hold weight, who pass each other the small materials of the work without ceremony, who do not need to say thank you for the passing, because the work itself is the thanks. He asked her once whether Aunt Honoria's canaries had names, and she said of course, Caesar and Pompey, and he wrote it down without smiling, and she did not smile either, and they went on. And the work of inventing a woman who did not exist became, by some quiet alchemy, the work of beginning to know each other. The winter female on the page was beginning to make her case. Clemency had got the line of the lateral right, the way it dipped just behind the gill cover and then ran clean to the wrist of the tail. She had got the small dark stippling along the upper flank, which in summer was a vivid violet, and in winter was the colour of old pewter. She had not yet got the eye. The eye of the grayling in winter was the difficulty. It had to be alive without being dramatic, present without being noticed. The eye of a fish that had survived a hard month and intended to survive the next. She had drawn it 3 times and rubbed it out 3 times, and at the 4th attempt she set the pen down and said, without looking up, "May I ask you a thing that is not about Aunt Honoria?" "You may." "The lady in Northumberland, what does she want?" He set down his own pen. He thought for a moment. "I do not know. That is part of the difficulty. I have met her twice. The first time, she was a child, and she liked horses. The second time, she was 17, and she had been told by her mother that I was the match, and she received me in a yellow drawing room with her hands folded, and answered my questions in complete and grammatical sentences, and asked me none. And I came away with the impression of a young woman who had been very thoroughly prepared, and who was, somewhere underneath the preparation, possibly furious, but I could not tell with whom. I have written to her 3 times from the Pyrenees in the last 6 years. She has written back 3 times. The letters were correct. They told me nothing." He paused. I had thought I was going north to find out what she wanted. I had not entirely admitted to myself that I was going north, hoping that what she wanted would be, plainly, not to marry me, because that would be the cleanest answer. I owe her, at minimum, the courtesy of asking the question. I do not yet know what I owe her beyond it. You owe her the truth. He looked at her across the table. Yes, I do. She picked up the pen and drew the eye of the winter female grayling at the 4th attempt, and got it on the 5th, and she set the pen down and pushed the paper a little toward him so he could see, and he leaned over and looked, and his face did a thing she had not seen it do, a small, private softening at the corner of the mouth that was not a smile, that was the expression of a man who had been shown something true. That is a fish that intends to live. It is. He sat back. He looked at her for a long moment. Clemency, he said, and the use of her given name was the first time he had used it, and it landed between them with the weight of every fence it had crossed to get there.
I'm going to write to Northumberland tonight.
I am going to write to the lady, not to her father, and I am going to ask her, plainly, whether she wishes the match. I am going to tell her that I have been caught by snow at an inn, and that the circumstance has clarified my mind. I am not going to mention you. I am not going to mention the engagement story. I am going to ask the question I should have asked 6 years ago, before my aunt began writing on my behalf in small ink. I want you to know that I am writing it. I want you to know what I am writing. I do not want you to find out from a notice in a paper, ever, what I have decided about anything that touches you. Theodore, she said, which was the first time she had used his, and his eyes closed for a fraction of a second when she did, the way a man's eyes close at the first warmth after a long cold, and she made herself go on. Write it. I will not read it. I do not want to read it. But write it tonight. He wrote it that night. She heard the scratch of the pen across the parlor while she sat on the daybed with the folio open on her knees and pretended to be reviewing the 11 finished plates. She did not turn to watch him write. When he had finished, he sealed the letter with a plain wafer and laid it on the corner of the writing desk where the morning post would find it, and he sat down by the fire, and he said to the fire, "It will go at 6. It will go at 6, she said to the folio. He went to his own room, the small one at the head of the stair, where he had slept since Monday, at 11. The fire was mended at 1 in the morning by hands that were not hers. She did not see him do it. She woke at the soft sound of the door, and lay still and watched, through her lashes, his shape at the hearth in shirt and breeches, kneeling, building a log into the embers with the patience of a man who had built 1,000 fires in the dark and meant the woman in the room to keep sleeping. He stood when the log had caught. He stood at the foot of the daybed for a long moment, not looking at her, looking at the folio she had set on the floor within reach of her hand. He bent then, very carefully, and adjusted the brown paper around the folio, so that the half-finished female grayling was not exposed to the air. And he straightened, and he went out without looking at her face, and the latch settled into its keeper for the 4th time that day. She lay awake a long time afterwards in the warmed dark, and she understood, with a part of her mind that did not ordinarily speak so plainly, that she had fallen in love sometime between the stable-yard and the still-room, and that the falling had nothing to do with the title, or the rescue, or the borrowed greatcoat, and everything to do with a man who fixed the wrapping of her folio in the dark, because he had understood, on the first morning, that it was the thing she had carried through the snow, and that what one carried through a snow was what one was. The letter went at 6. She did not see it go. She heard the postboy in the yard at 5:30, and she heard the brief exchange of voices below, and she heard the hoofbeats receding toward the south, where the road had been cleared as far as Hatfield by a gang of men with shovels paid out of the Duke's own purse, which Clemency had learned about only because Mrs. Pell had mentioned it in passing while bringing up the morning bread, and which the Duke had not mentioned at all. The road north opened on Thursday at noon. The Hertford coach passengers left in 2 batches, the second under a sky that had cleared to a hard winter blue, and Mr. Halford of Lincoln's Inn left with them, and did not come up to pay his respects, having been informed by Mrs. Pell at breakfast that the lady was indisposed, and the gentleman engaged with private correspondence. The common room emptied. The inn, for the first time in 4 days, went quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight, the quiet that follows a long noise.
He came into the parlour at 3, with the cold of the yard on him and a folded paper in his hand. He set the paper on the table. He did not sit. The road to London opens tomorrow at first light. The Hatfield coach will take you as far as Barnet by noon, and you can hire a chaise from Barnet to Paternoster Row, and be at your publisher's door by 4. I have spoken to Mrs. Pell. She has a niece in service in Cheapside, who can travel with you as far as London for the price of her coach ticket back. You will arrive with a respectable woman beside you, and the folio in your lap, and your reputation, so far as this house can guarantee it, intact. He stopped. He looked at the folded paper on the table, and then at her. I would prefer to go with you. I know I cannot.
The story we are keeping requires that we arrive separately, by separate roads, and that the story of the Snowdon betrothal travel ahead of both of us, and meet us at our respective destinations, as a rumor rather than a sight. I have written this morning to my aunt. I have told her that I will not be continuing north this week, that the road has clarified my mind, that I have written to the lady in Northumberland directly, and that I will await her answer before I take any further step. I have not, in that letter either, mentioned you. I will not mention you to anyone until the lady has had the courtesy of her own answer. After that, he said, I would like, if you will permit it, to call on your mother in Winchester, not as the Duke of Weatherbourne,
as Theodore Ravenhall, who met your daughter at an inn in a snowstorm, and would like, very much, the privilege of being properly introduced. He paused. The afternoon light through the window was thin and cold and very clean. The fire spoke once and was quiet. I have no claim on you. I want that said. You handed me a sentence on Monday night that I did not earn, and that I have spent 4 days trying to deserve. The deserving is the work of years, not days. I do not ask you for an answer now. I ask you only for the permission to begin. She stood. She crossed the small room to the writing desk, and she picked up the finished folio. The 12th plate dry, the brown paper replaced with a fresh sheet Mrs. Pell had produced from a drawer that contained, evidently, anything required of it. And she held the folio against her stomach, the way she had held it through the snow. She turned to face him. You have my permission. Come in February. Come after the lady has answered. Come as yourself. He nodded once. He did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. The space between them held, the careful arm's length he had kept since the first night, and she understood that the holding of it was a thing he was doing on purpose, because the lie was still alive in the corridor outside, and the truth of what was between them was something neither of them was willing to spend prematurely. He left the parlour at 4 to see to his own onward journey, and Clemency sat down at the writing desk and wrote, on the back of a sheet of the saddler's cartridge paper, a note to her mother in Winchester that began, The folio is delivered. The rent is paid. I will tell you the rest in person. Do not worry. The snow was nothing I could not walk through. And she sealed it with a wafer and gave it to Mrs. Pell to send with the morning post. She left the Boar and Hawthorn at 6 the next morning with Mrs. Pell's niece beside her in the coach, a quiet girl named Anne, who slept most of the way to Barnet, and the folio across her knees, and she reached the publisher in Paternoster Row at 3:30 on the afternoon of the 31st of January, with 31 hours to spare. And she handed the folio across the counter to the engraver's foreman, who unwrapped it on the spot, and looked through the plates one by one in the failing London light. When he came to the 12th, the winter female, he stopped. He held the plate up to the window. He set it down again with the particular care of a man who had been handling other people's work for 40 years and knew, when a plate was better than the commission, to acknowledge it. This one we will engrave first. Tell C.A. the second printing will carry her name on the title page if she'll allow it. Tell her yourself. C. A is Clemency Ashford. I would like, please, my name on the second printing. I would also like, please, to be commissioned for the Chub. The foreman looked at her for a long moment. He nodded. The Chub, by Michaelmas. 5 guineas in advance.
Come back Monday. She walked out into Paternoster Row in the cold, thin London dusk, with 5 guineas in her reticule, and her own name about to go on a title page, for the first time in 3 years. And she thought of a man at a fire in Hertfordshire, mending a log into embers in the dark. And she thought of him with a steadiness that surprised her. And she walked to the inn in Holborn, where Anne was waiting with the trunks, and she went home to Winchester on the Saturday coach, with the rent for the quarter in an envelope, and a commission for the autumn in her pocket, and a private knowledge in her chest that she did not yet share with her mother, because she had promised, in a parlour in Hertfordshire, to let a letter go to Northumberland, and a letter come back from it, before she said the thing aloud. The letter from Northumberland reached her in Winchester on the 18th of February. It was not the letter she had expected. It was a short letter in a young woman's hand, addressed to Miss Clemency Ashford of the High Street, Winchester, and it had been sent enclosed in a longer letter from the lady to the Duke, and forwarded by him, unopened by him, with a note in his own hand on the outside that read only, "She asked me to send this to you. I have not read it. I leave the reading to you." Clemency read the lady's letter in the back parlour of the small house that smelled, always, of the river. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was a brief, polite account of the lady's circumstances. She had wished, for 6 years, not to marry the Duke of Weatherbourne, and had been unable to say so, and had been grateful beyond measure when his recent letter had given her an opening she had not believed would come. The second was a fuller account of what she did wish. There was a man, a steward's son, who had been her brother's friend at school, and she had loved him since she was 16, and her father would consent now that the Duke had withdrawn. The third paragraph was about Clemency. It said, "I do not know the circumstances of your acquaintance with his Grace. He was careful in his letter to me not to write of them. I know only that he wrote in a different tone than he has ever written before, and I have long enough understood the previous tone to recognize the change. I write to you, not to him, to say only this. Be kind to him. He is, I think, a person who has been carefully not loved for a long time, and he will not know, at first, how to receive it. From a person who is about to be very happy in a way she did not expect, to a person who I suspect is on the edge of the same surprise. Go gently. Yours, etc. Cecilia Marwood." Clemency folded the letter. She put it in the drawer of the small writing desk in the back parlour. She did not show it to her mother. She wrote, that evening, to Theodore Ravenhall at the address he had given her in his note. 3 lines only. "The lady has written. She is, I think, about to be very happy. Come when you can." And she sealed it and sent it in the morning post. He came on the 23rd of February, a Wednesday, in the late afternoon,
in a hired chaise from the Winchester posting house, alone, in plain travelling dress and a different greatcoat from any she had seen.
Her mother received him in the front parlour with the careful neutrality of a woman who had been told only that an acquaintance from a coaching inn would call, and he conducted himself with such quiet, ordinary courtesy across the first quarter hour that Clemency's mother relaxed visibly into her chair and began to talk about the river fog, which was the conversation by which her mother judged a man, and he answered her about the river fog with the attention of a man who had spent 6 years in mountain weather and respected fog as a category. And Clemency, sitting by the window with a piece of mending in her lap and not mending it, watched her mother's face and watched his face and waited. After a half hour, her mother, who was not a fool, suggested that Clemency might walk Mr.
Ravenhall to the Cathedral Close, which was a fine walk on a clear February afternoon, and Clemency fetched her cloak, a new one, plain dark wool, paid for with part of the 2nd guinea from Paternoster Row, and they went out into the late thin light and turned toward the Close. They walked without speaking for the length of the High Street. At the gate of the Close he stopped and looked up at the west front of the cathedral for a long moment, and then he looked at her, and he said plainly, "The lady is to be married in April, to a man named John Carteret. Her father has consented. She wrote to me last week. She wrote also, she tells me, to you." "She did. What did she write to you?" "She wrote that I should be kind to you. She wrote that you had been carefully not loved for a long time. She wrote that I should go gently." He looked at the west front again. The light on the stone was the colour of weak tea, the colour of Mrs. Pell's wrapper, the colour of a winter wrist. That was generous of her. It was. They walked on into the Close. There were rooks in the elms making the late sound rooks make in February. There was no one else in the Close. The grass underfoot was still half frozen where the shadow lay across it. At the door of the deanery he stopped again. He turned to her. He did not take her hand. He looked at her face in the thin light with the same particular attention he'd given the 11 finished plates on the first morning at the inn, and he said quietly, "Clemency, I am going to ask you a question. I would like you to answer it as plainly as you answered me on the first night. Ask, will you marry me?" She did not answer at once. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did the thing she had been working her way toward for 3 weeks. She reached up, her hand quite steady, her fingers warm, and she undid the top button of her cloak at the throat, the small bone button just under the chin, the same place the wet ribbon had been on the first night, and she let the cloak fall open an inch, no more, and she said plainly, "Yes." He looked down at her hand at her throat. He looked back at her face. He understood the inversion at once, the small, honest inversion of the opening line, made not by him but by her, the unbinding of a throat done by her own warm fingers, in clean afternoon light, because she chose it. And his face did the thing she had seen it do once before, the small, private softening at the corner of the mouth that was not a smile, but was the expression of a man who had been shown something true. He did not kiss her in the deanery yard. He reached up instead and laid the back of his bare hand, very briefly, against the side of her throat where the button had been, and he let it rest there for the space of 1 breath, and he took it away, and he said quietly, "Thank you." And they walked back through the Close toward her mother's house, with the rooks still talking overhead, and the Grayling Folio's 12th plate, just then, on a press in Paternoster Row, taking the first true bite of the engraver's burin under the printed initials of her full name. A few moments in this one stayed with me, a steel nib in a cedar holder set down at a stranger's elbow, a still room full of lavender, where a woman who had decided everything pretended she had decided nothing, a top button undone in clean afternoon light by a hand that could finally feel itself. If any of them stayed with you too, subscribing keeps the next one close. See you then.